Bago natin simulan ang kwento, siguraduhing nakasubscribe ka para hindi mo mamiss ang mga susunod na kabanata at iba pang mga nakaka-excite na istorya. I-click ang subscribe button ngayon din. Nagliliwanag ang mga ilaw ng skyline na Manhattan sa makintab na salaming dingding ng punong tanggapan ng Martin & Kruger International. Ang gusali mismo ay isang simbolo ng tagumpay at karangyaan, isang patunay sa makapangyarihang presensya ni William Kruger I. Ang bilyonaryong na kilala sa kanyang matigas na ambisyon, malupit na taktika sa negosyo, at hilig sa pagpapakita ng kanyang estado. Sa edad na 42, nalampasan na niya ang lahat ng kanyang mga kaibal sa industriya ng teknolohiya. Sinakop ang mga merkado sa cloud computing, biomedical intelligence, at mga makabagong solusyon sa cybersecurity. Ngunit alam ng sinumang may alam na sa ilalim ng makintab na balatkayo ng mga panayam tungkol sa pagkakawanggawa at mararangyang pagitipon, para sa kawanggawa ay may isang pusong kasing lamig at kasing tigas ng bato. Matagal nang nakauwi ang karamihan sa mga empleyado sa mataong mga lansangan sa ibaba. Isang nag-iisang tao ang naglilinis ng marmol na sahig ng executive corridor. Ito si Aurora, Rory, Madrigal, isang 26 na taong gulang na Pilipinang janitor na dumating sa Estados Unidos 4 na taon na ang nakararaan. Siya ay may katamtamang tangkad at may hindi kapansin-pansing indik. Ngunit ang kanyang mga mata, malambot at kayumanggi, ay kumikislap ng pahimik na determinasyon sa tuwing nagsasalita siya tungkol sa kanyang tahanan o sa kanyang mga pangarap. Ipinagmamalaki niya ang kanyang trabaho, gaano man ito kababa, dahil ang bawat sweldong kanyang kinikita ay nagpapaaral sa kanyang nakababatang kapatid sa kolehiyo sa Maynila. Sa panlabas, si Aurora ay tila mahinhin at tahimik. Mabait siya sa lahat, mula sa mga intern sa mailroom hanggang sa lupon ng mga direktor na dumadaan na nakasuot ng malulutong na business suit, at pinananatili niyang nakayuko ang kanyang ulo. Ang hindi alam ng marami, ang hindi naisip ng sinuman sa gusali ng Martin & Kruger, ay mayroong itinatagong hilig si Aurora na kanyang pinagyaman mula pa noong kanyang pagkabata. Nagsimula siyang sumayaw, halos kasabay ng kanyang pagkatutong lumakat. Ang kanyang ina ay isang guro sa probinsya, at ang kanyang ama ay dating tagapagturo ng katutubong sayaw na naglalakbay sa buong kapuluan ng Pilipinas, na nagpapakilala ng mga tradisyonal na sayaw sa mga lokal na komunidad. Inuruan niya si Aurora ng lahat mula sa tinikling hanggang sa mga masalimuot na sayaw ng modernong jazz at ballet, na naggayabong ng isang kagandahang tila sa lungat sa kanyang tahimik na personalidad. Ang mga fluorescent na ilaw ay umuugong sa itaas, habang isinasawsaw ni Aurora ang kanyang mop sa tubig na may sabon. Ang kanyang isip ay lumilipad sa maliit na dance studio na madalas niyang puntahan noon sa Maynila. Sa kabila ng pagtutol ng kanyang ina na ang pagsasayaw ay hindi magbibigay ng pagkain sa mesa, iginiit ng ama ni Aurora na gawing bahagi ng budget ng pamilya ang kanyang mga sapatos na pangsayaw. Mayroon siyang espesyal na bagay, sabi niya, isang bagay na nagpapaliwanag sa kanyang mukha kapag nagsimula ang musika. Ngunit mula nang dumating sa Estados Unidos sa isang work visa, natagpuan ni Aurora na ang kanyang mga araw ay puno ng paghahanap buhay para sa kanyang pangangailangan. Ang kanyang pangarap, ang pagpunta sa mga audition, pagkuha ng buwesto sa isang dance troupe, pagtatanghal sa mga tunay na lugar, ay nanatiling isang malayong pantasya na natatakpan ng mga bayarin sa upa at padala sa pamilya. Nang gabing iyon, habang masigasig na nagtatrabaho si Aurora upang linisin ang pasilyo, umalingaw-ngaw ang mga boses at halakhakan mula sa opisina sa sulok. Bahagyang nakabukas ang pinto. Sinubukan niyang huwag makinig sa kanyang mga nakatataas. Ngunit mahirap na hindi mainig ang maingay na pag-uusap. Sa loob ng malaking opisina na iyon, isang grupo ng mga ehekutibo ang nagtoast gamit ang mga baso ng mamahaling tsampag. Si William Kruger ay namumuno sa kanila na parang isang hay. Suot ang isang pinasadya na navisuit na malamang ay mas mahal pa sa taunang sweldo ni Aurora. Katatapos lang niyang gumawa ng isang napakalaking kasunduan. Pinagsama ang Martin & Kruger sa isang mas maliit na European robotics firm. Isang acquisition na lalo pang magpapatibay sa kanyang posisyon sa pandaigdigang merkado. Ang pagdiriwang ay eksklusibo, mga top-tier na manager, ilang mga konektadong investor, at ang bagong dating na mula sa European Robotics Division, isang matangkad at paat na lalaki na nagngangalang Helmut Fischer. Sa simula, inakala ni Aurora na isa lamang itong pangkaraniwang pagdiriwang ng tagumpay sa negosyo pagkatapos ng trabaho. Sinubukan niyang kumilos ng maingat, sinisigurong hindi malaman ang kanyang presensya, habang pinupunasan niya ang sahig malapit sa bukas na pinto. Ngunit pagkatapos ay narinig niya ang boses ni Kruger na umuugong. Isang regalo para sa ating kaibigang si Helmut. Kailangan kong ipakita sa kanya kung gaano natin pinahahalagahan ang ating mga international partner dito sa Big Apple. Ang ilan sa mga ehekutibo ay nagpalitan ng nerbiyosong tawanan. Ang mga nakakakilala kay William Kruger ay alam na siya ay hindi mahuhulaan tulad ng kung gaano siya kapangyarihan. Pumitik siya ng kanyang mga daliri sa isang junior manager. Isang namumula ang mukha na lalaki sa kanyang kalagitnaan ng 30 taon. Bigyan mo ako ng isang bagay, sabi ni Kruger na may halos baliw na kagalakan. Isang libangan para mabawasan ang nakakabagot na usapan tungkol sa synergy at market share. Isang bagay na masaya, isang bagay na hindi pa nakikita ni Helmut. Ang junior manager, na hindi sigurado kung ano ang gagawin, ay nautal. Maaari tayong. Ibig kong sabihin, maaari tayong kumuha ng isang tao mula sa lokal na club. O marahil, maaari tayong pumunta sa downtown kung gusto mong makakita ng nightlife. Ngunit iwinagayway ni Kruger ang kanyang kamay na parang tinataboy ang sinabi. Napakawalang orihinal. Kailangan natin ng isang in-house na palabas. Isang bagay na hindi inaasahan. Inilibot niya ang kanyang tingin sa paligid ng silid hanggang sa dumapo ang kanyang mga mata sa may pintuan, na tumapat sa anino ni Aurora. Ang biglang pagtahimik ay nagpahiwatig na napansin nilang lahat siya. Naramdaman ni Aurora ang pagtayo ng mga balahibo sa kanyang bato. Maraming beses na siyang nagtatrabaho ng lampas sa oras. Ngunit hindi pa siya nakakuha ng direktang atensyon ng si. Hoy! Tawag ni Kruger, lumayo sa karamihan. Ikaw doon. Bago ka, tama? Ang tagalinis. Nanigas si Aurora ng isang segundo. Iniipon ang kanyang sarili habang humakbang siya papasok sa opisina. Magandang gabi, sir. Ako po si Aurora. Ilang buwan na po akong nagtatrabaho dito. Ang kanyang boses ay matatag, kahit na mahina. Ang ilang mahinang tawanan ay umalingaw-ngaw sa mga lasing na ehekutibo, na humihigop ng tiyampag at tinitingnan siya na parabang isa siyang nakakatuwang palabas. Sumulong si Kruger, iniikot ang kanyang sariling baso na may yabang na nagpapalabas ng pagmamataas. Nakikita mo ba ito? Umuro siya kay Helmut na may magalang, ngunit medyo malamig na ekspresyon. Ito ang isa sa aming mga pinakabagong kasosyo sa tagumpay. Si Helmut Pfister. Naglakbay siya ng malayo para makapunta dito. Gusto naming ipakita sa kanya na alam namin kung paano magsaya. Tama, Helmut. Nagbigay si Helmut ng isang hindi makahulugang tango at pilit na ngiti. Nahuli ni Aurora ang kislap ng pagkabalisa sa kanyang mga mata. Marahil ay hindi niya lubos na sinasang-ayunan ang marangyang pagpapakita ni Kruger. Ngunit hindi hahamunin ni Helmut ang kanyang punong abala sa harap ng lahat. Binalik ni Kruger ang kanyang atensyon kay Aurora. Ipinagdiriwang natin ang isang malaking kasunduan, na nangangahulugang lahat ng tao, sa gusaling ito ngayong gabi, ay magiging bahagi ng kasiyahan. Kaya iniisip ko, maaari kang magbigay ng kaunting palabas para sa amin. Namula ang mga pisngi ni Aurora. Isang palabas. Ama ba ang narinig niya? Hinawakan niya ang hawakan ng kanyang mop. Hindi lubos na naniniwalang siya ang kinakausap. Wala siyang balak na magtanghal para sa isang grupo ng mga lasing at makapangyarihang estranghero. Ngunit ang banta sa kalahating ngiti ni Kruger ang nagpalunok sa kanya ng kanyang protesta. Kailangan niya ang trabahong ito. Ang kanyang katayuan sa visa ay delikado, nakasalalay sa patuloy na trabaho. Kahit na ang isang bahid ng pagsuway ay maaaring magbanta sa kanyang posisyon. Sir, simulan niya ng maingat. Hindi ko po akalain na bahagi iyon ng aking. Itinaas ni Kruger ang isang kamay. Teka, may naisip ako, sabi niya, bumaling sa isa sa mga ehekutibo. Davis, hindi ba nakita ko ang ilang video ng mga miyembro ng staff sa nakaraang holiday party na sumasayaw? Siguro makikita natin kung anong klaseng galaw ang mayroon ang ating kaibigan dito. Galing siya sa Pilipinas, ama. Sigurado akong mayroon silang mga kawili-wiling sayaw doon. Narinig ko ang isang bagay tungkol sa mga kawayan at pagtalon-talon. O baka ginagawa nila ang mga routine ng showgirl sa ilang mga lugar. Sumabog ang tawanan, bagaman ang ilan ay tumawa ng higit pa sa takot kaysa sa tunay na libangan. Nag-init ang mga pisngi ni Aurora. Naramdaman niyang minaliis siya. Ang tinikling, ang katutubong sayaw na kanyang tinutukoy, ay maganda at makasaysayan, hindi isang biro sa party. Gayunpaman, pinilit niya ang isang ngiti. Isang reflex na nagtago sa kahihiyang gumagapang sa kanyang gulugot. May alam po akong ilang mga sayaw, Mr. Kruger. Sabi niya ng mahina, umaasang mapapayapa siya nito upang mabilis siyang makatakas. Ngunit sigurado akong may mas propesyonal na paraan upang pumigil ka sa pagsasalita. Putol ni Cougar, hindi masama ngunit may diretsahang nagpapahiwatig na sanay siya sa ganap na pagsuno. Kung gayon, tingnan natin. Sumayaw ka ng kaunti o kahit ano para sa kasiyahan ni Yar Fischer. Ituring mo itong isang espesyal na kahilingan mula sa iyong amo. Kumakabog ang kanyang puso. Nakakahiya ito, 1,000 beses na higit pa dahil lahat ng mata ay nasa kanya. Ang ilan sa mga ehekutibo ay may mga ekspresyong mula sa hindi komportableng awa hanggang sa mahinang pagtataka. Ngunit wala ni isa sa kanila ang nagsalita upang ipagtanggol siya. Ang kanilang mga sweldo ay masyadong nakadepende sa mabuting kalooban ni Kruger. Sumulyap si Aurora mula sa bawat mukha. Nararamdaman ang bigat ng kanilang mga itig. Alam na kung tumanggi siya, ang kanyang kabuhayan ay maaaring nasa panganib. Pinagdikit niya ang kanyang mga labi, tinatawag ang harapan ng katahimikan. Ang alaala ng malumanay na tinig ng kanyang ama ay umalingaw-ngaw sa kanyang isipan. Kapag sumasayaw ka, sumayaw ka ng buong puso. Kahit na ang iyong madla ay ang hangin lamang. Ngunit ang pagsasayaw sa ilalim ng mga pangyayaring ito ay hindi isang pagtatanghal ng kagalakan. Ito ay isang sapilitang palabas. Gayunpaman, kung gagayin niya ito, nagpasya siyang gawin ito ng may dignidad. Sige, sabi ni Aurora, ang kanyang mamata ay naggapagalagala para sa anumang uri ng musika. Maaari akong magbigay ng isang mabilis na pagpapakita. Ngunit kakailanganin ko ng kaunting espasyo. Ngumisi si Kruger, umatras at inunat ang kanyang mga braso. Tinatawag ang iba na umatras. Ang ilang mga confetti ribbons mula sa isang naunang tuost ay nakakalat sa karpet. At ang mga baso ng champagne ay kumakalampag sa mesa habang magalang na inilapag ni Yar Fischer ang kanyang baso. Huminga ng malalim si Aurora, binabaliwala ang pag-ikot ng pagkabalisa sa kanyang tiyan. Inikot niya ang kanyang mga balikap pabalik. Walang nagpatugtog ng anumang musika. Ang katahimikan ay nabasag lamang ng malayong ugong ng bentilasyon. Naggasya si Aurora na umasa sa panloob na ritmo na gumabay sa kanyang mga hakbang mula pa noong paggabata. Kung kailangan niyang tiisin ito, gagawin niya ito sa kanyang sariling mga tuntunin. Nagsimula siya sa isang simpleng pagdaloy sa kanyang mga braso, malambot, kontrolado. Ang kanyang mga paa ay lumipat ng maganda sa malambot na karpet, na lumilikha ng isang mabagal, katamtamang pattern na parabang nakakarinig siya ng isang malambing na himig sa kanyang ulo. Sa kabila ng pagiging sapilitan, sa kabila ng pakiramdam na nabawasan sa isang bagong bagay, natagpuan niya ang mahinang kislap ng pagsasayaw muli. Ang mga salita ng kanyang ama ang gumabay sa kanya. Ang kagandahan ay wala sa kapaligiran. Ang kagandahan ay nasa iyo. Unti-unti, nagdagdag siya ng kaunting flair. Lumipat siya sa isang estilong nakapagpapaalaala sa ilang mga kontemporaryong piraso na kanyang sinanay sa Maynila. Inunat niya ang kanyang mga binti, nagbabalanse saglit sa arabeske, bago dahan-dahang umiko. Hindi niya binawi ang pakikipag-ugnay sa mata sa pattern ng sahig ng matagal. Ngunit ang isang mabilis na sulyap pataas ay nagsiwalat na ang ilang mga manonood ay natahimik, marahil ay nagulat sa pagbabago ng isang mahiyaing janitor sa isang magandang mananayaw. Ang sandali ay panandalian lamang. Si Kruger, na nakasandal sa gilid ng kanyang napakalaking mahogany desk, ay naglabas ng isang biglaang tawa. Isang matalim na pahol na bumutas sa maselan na atmosfera na hinahabi ni Aurora. Mabuti na iyan, pero halika, gusto namin ng isang bagay na mas may excitement. Anunsyo niya, na nag-iingay. Hindi ba mayroong ilang uri ng kakaibang, tradisyonal na sayaw na ginagawa mo na may malalaking galaw? O baka isang bagay na sexy kung komportable ka doon. Nasa hustong gulang tayo dito. Nanigas si Aurora, ang kanyang mapisngi ay nag-init sa matinding kahihiyan. Ang mga alaala ng ginikling at tradisyonal na katutubong pagtatanghal ay bumaha sa kanyang isipan. Ang mga ito ay hindi kailanman sinadya para sa palilibak o sexual na pagsasamantala. Ang mga ito ay sinadya upang ipagdiwang ang kultura, kasaysayan, at pagmamalaki. Nag-atubili siya. Ngunit ang bilog ng mga tagamasid ay naging umaasa. Halos maramdaman niya silang mentally na pinipilit siyang sumunod sa mga hinihingi ng si. Sige, sabi niya, halos pabulong na ang boses. Huminga siya ulit ng isa pang pampakalma. Mabuti, naisip niya. Kung gusto nila ng kakaiba, maipapakita niya sa kanila ang mga hakbang sa tinikling, bagaman karaniwan. Nagising si Aurora sa umaga ng kumperensya ng mga mamumuhunan na may kabog ng takot sa kanyang giyan. Ang kaganapan ay naging usap-usapan sa opisina sa loob ng maraming linggo, at mula pa noong nakakahiyang paligsahan sa sayaw, sa auditorium, alam niya, sa kaibuturan ng kanyang puso, na hindi palalambasin ni William Kruger ang pagkakataong iparada siya sa harap ng kanyang mga kilalang bisita. Halos marinig niya ang kanyang mapang-uyam na boses sa kanyang ulo, na pinag-usapan ang tungkol sa mga nakatagong talento, at pinipilit siyang magtanghal para sa mga mayayamang lalaki at babae na may stake sa kanyang imperyo. Pinilit niyang bumangon sa kama, nilunok ang natitirang malamig na kape, habang binubuksan ang isang maliit na lampara sa kanyang masikip na silid tulugan. Ang mga scrap ng mga tala tungkol sa mga bagong kakdang paglilinis ay naakalat sa kanyang bedside table. Katabi mismo ng larawan ng kanyang nakababatang kapatid na babae na nakatuga at may ngiti, na buong pagmamalaking nakatayo sa seremonya ng pagtatapos ng kolehiyo sa Maynila. Initigan ni Aurora ang larawang iyon ng ilang sandali. Pinaalalahanan ang kanyang sarili na ang bawat sakripisyo, bawat sandali ng kahihiyan, ay para magkaroon ng kinabukasan ang kanyang kapatid. Umalis siya sa kanyang maliit na inuupahang silid at sumakay ng subway papuntang Manhattan, dumadaan sa walang katapusang dagat ng mga estranghero. Suot niya ang kanyang karaniwang uniforme sa trabaho at may dalang pamalit na damit sa isang bag, kung sakali. Ayaw niyang magsuot ng anumang magarbong damit, hindi para kay Kruger, ngunit pinaghihinalaan niyang maaaring kailanganin niya ang isang bagay na mas angkop kung mapipilitan siya sa isa pang pagtatanghal. Ang tensyon ay parang salansan sa paligid ng kanyang mga padyang, na nagpahirap sa kanyang huminga. Nang dumating si Aurora sa tour ng Martin & Kruger International, ang lobby ay abala. Ang mga empleyado ay nakasuot ng formal na kasuotan. Ang mga security guard ay nagmamadaling suriin ang mga credential ng mga gumagalang bisita, at ang mga matataas na banner na may logo ng kumpanya ay nakahanay sa mga dingding. Ang mga grupo ng mga mukhang importanteng tao, ang ilan sa kanila ay may mga European accent, ang iba ay naka-crisp na suit mula sa buong estados, ay naglalakad, pinag-usapan ang aray, mga bahagi ng merkado, at ang susunod na malaking paglulunsad ng produkto. Sinubukan ni Aurora na dumaan ng hindi nakakakuha ng atensyon. Ngunit higit sa ilan ang nakakilala sa kanya bilang ang sumasayaw na janitor, tumango o nag-aalok ng nakikiramay na kalahating ngiti. Nagmadali siyang pumunta sa supply room. Isang alon ng ginhawa ang bumalot sa kanya nang matagpuan niya itong walang laman. Binuksan niya ang kanyang locker at hinubad ang kanyang jacket, naghahanda para sa mga gawain sa paglilinis sa araw na iyon. Habang kukunin na niya ang kanyang kadi ng mga gamit panlinis, bumukas ang pinto. Natigilan si Aurora, sigurado siyang baka si Kruger iyon o isa sa kanyang mga alipors. Ngunit si Denise lang pala, ang kanyang direktang supervisor. Si Denise ay humihingal, na para bang nagmadali siyang bumaba ng 2 palapag. Aurora, nandyan ka pala, sabi ni Denise, hinahawi ang kanyang buhok mula sa kanyang mukha. Makinig ka, nakakuha ako ng balita mula sa itaas. Gusto nilang nandoon ka sa auditorium sa tanghali. Isang uri ng rehearsal para sa investor showcase ngayong hapon. Nalaglag ang sikmura ni Aurora. Rehearsal? Para saan? Inilapag niya ang kanyang mga gamit panlinis. Ang kanyang boses ay mahigpit. Nagkibit balikat si Denise. May sinabi sila tungkol sa pagpapakita mo ng iyong sayaw para sa mga inimbitahang bisita. Paumanhin. Sinabi nila sa akin na sabihin sa iyo na mandatory ito. Huminto siya. Ang simpatiya ay nagniningning sa kanyang mga mata. Tingnan mo kung kailangan mong makipag-usap. Hindi, sabi ni Aurora, lumuluno. Salamat, Denise. Ako lang. Humina ang boses niya. Hindi niya maipahayag ang pag-ikot ng takot, galit, at resignasyon sa loob niya. Nag-alok si Denise ng nakakaaliw na tapik sa braso ni Aurora at umalis. Ang pinto ng supply room ay dahan-dahang sumara muli. Iniwan si Aurora sa katahimikan. Initigan niya ang kadi ng mga gamit panlinis. Pagkatapos ay sumulyap siya sa mga sapatos na pangsayaw na sinimulan niyang itago sa kanyang locker. Nakulong siya, walang ilusyon tungkol dito. Si William Kruger pa rin ang kanyang amo, ang taong may kapangyarihang baligtayin ang kanyang trabaho at, dahil dito, ang kanyang buong buhay sa Estados Unidos. Kasabay nito, ang kislap ng pagsuway na naramdaman niya noong unang gabi sa kanyang opisina ay umusbong sa loob niya. Naalala niya ang mga salita ni Yar Fischer sa maalikabok na silid sa basement. Patuloy kang magsanay ng iyong sayaw, ngunit gawin mo ito para sa iyong sarili. Hindi para sa kanya. Sa nanginginig na mga kamay, isinara niya ang kanyang locker at umalis patungo sa auditorium. Dumating siya upang matagpuan ang isang halos hindi makatotohanang setup. Ang malaking espasyo ay binago sa isang gabi sa isang showcase environment, kumpleto sa isang entablado, maliwanag na mga spotlight, isang LED backdrop, at mga malalambot na upuan na nakaayos sa maayos na mga hilera. Sa malayong sulok, ang mga caterer ay nag-alala tungkol sa mga horse de oeuvres at champagne flutes. Sinubukan ng mga technician ang mga mikropono, kamera, at ang overhead lighting system. Sa gitna ng lahat ng ito ay nakatayo si William Kruger, na napapaligiran ng isang grupo ng mga nakabihis na individual. Nakilala ni Aurora ang ilan mula sa huling pagkakataon. Mga executive at miyembro ng board, ang ilan ay mula sa European Robotics Division. At nakatayo ng bahagyang hiwalay, mga kamay sa kanyang bulsa, ay si Yar Helmut Fischer. Nahuli niya ang mata ni Aurora, nag-aalok ng isang banayad na pango. Aurora! Tawag ni Kruger, sa sandaling nakita niya siya. Ang kanyang tono ay may pilit na kasiyahan, na para bang tinatawag ang isang minamahal na kaibigan sa halip na isang nag-aatubiling empleyado. Naglakad siya papalapit sa kanya. Magandang umaga, Mr. Kruger. Sabi niya ng mahina, pinipilit ang isang magalang na ngiti. Mabuti at nakarating ka, sabi niya, pinagdikit ang kanyang mga kamay. Mayroon tayong malaking araw sa hinaharap. Gusto ng mga pangunahing mamumuhunan na makita hindi lamang ang aming mga demo ng produkto, kundi pati na rin ang isang lasa ng aming masiglang kultura ng korporasyon. Lumawak ang kanyang ngiti, na nagpakita ng isang hanay ng mga kumikinang nanngipin. Doon ka papasok. Wala siyang inaasahan. Lumunok si Aurora. Ano po ang gusto ninyong gain ko, sir? Dinala siya ni Kruger sa entablado. Ikinumpas niya ng malaki. Itinuturo ang mga LED screen sa likod nila. Magkakaroon tayo ng isang segment mamayang hapon, bago ang panghuling paglulunsad ng produkto, kung saan magsasalita ako tungkol sa pagpapalakas ng empleyado, pagkakaiba-iba, at lahat ng iyon. Pagkatapos ay ipakikilala kita. Lalabas ka at gagawin mo ang iyong bagay. Sumayaw. Pahangain sila. Panatilihin ito sa mga 3 hanggang 4 na minuto, at gayin mo itong, alam mo na, masigla. Isang bagay na magpapausap sa kanila. Ang mga mata ni Aurora ay kumislap kay Yar Fischer, na ang ekspresyon ay bantay. Naisip niya kung nagtagumpay ba siya sa pagpigil kay Kruger. Mukhang hindi. Inilit niyang kumango. Opo, sir, sagot niya. Ang matagumpay na ngiti ni Kruger ay mas mukhang ngiti ng isang soro na na-corner ang kanyang biktima. Perpekto, sabi niya. Sa tanghali, bumalik ka dito para sa isang mabilis na run-through kasama ang audio tech. Pagkatapos ay magtatanghal ka bandang 3 oras. Huwag kang mahuli. Iwinagayway niya ang isang kamay, na nagpapahiwatig na malaya na siyang umalis. Umalikod siya, kumakabog ang kanyang puso, nararamdaman ang pag-ikot ng kawalan ng kakayahan na lumalapit. Ngunit habang nilalampasan niya si Yar Fischer, marahan nitong hinawakan ang kanyang siko. Hindi siya nagsalita, masyadong maraming mata sa paligid, ngunit ang kanyang tingin ay nagpahayag ng pagkakaisa. Nagbigay siya ng isang maliit na pango bilang kapalit bago lumabas sa entablado. Sinusubukang panatilihin ang kanyang pagpipigil. Ang mga oras na humahantong sa tanghali ay ang ilan sa mga pinaka-nakakabagabag na naranasan ni Aurora. Sinubukan niyang abalahin ang kanyang sarili sa mga pangunahing gawain sa mga koridor, ngunit umikot ang kanyang isi. Nang dumating ang oras ng tanghalian, bumalik siya sa auditorium. Isang sound engineer ang nag-abot sa kanya ng isang maliit na wireless mic pa. Inanong siya ng isa pang technician kung anong musika ang gusto niyang sayawan. Wala siyang ideya dahil hindi pa siya nabigyan ng pagkakataong maghanda ng maayos. Kaya't nag-scroll siya sa mga track ng sound engineer, pumili ng isa na may matatag na beat at kahit ilang emosyonal na undertones, isang bagay na maaaring magpahintulos sa isang pagsasanib ng kontemporaryo at ang mga katutubong estilo na kanyang pinahahalagahan. Ginugol niya ang susunod na 20 minuto sa paggawa ng ilang pagsubok na galaw sa entablado, pag-aayos ng mga volume, pag-verify ng ilaw. Ang mga balisang tagapamahala at kawani ay nagmamadali, tinatapos ang bawat huling detalye ng kumperensya. Sa pagtingin sa paligid, nasilayan ni Aurora ang mga suit at cocktail dresses sa koridor, maagang dumating para sa mga kaganapan sa araw na yon. Ang sound engineer ay nagbigay kay Aurora ng thumbs up. Handa ka nang umalis kapag ginawag ka nila, sabi niya. Bumaba siya mula sa entablado at pumunta sa isang tahimik na sulok malapit sa mga kurtina sa likod ng entablado. Ang buong sitwasyon ay nagdala ng mapait na lasa sa kanyang bibig. Malapit na siyang magtanghal sa harap ng ilan sa mga pinakamakapangyarihang tao sa mundo ng negosyo, hindi para sa kanyang sariling artistikong pagpapahayag, kundi para sa balukot na uri ng pagtatanghal ni Kruger. Ngunit naalala niya ang mga salita ng kanyang ama, kapag sumayaw ka ng buong puso. Kahit na ang iyong madla ay ang hangin lamang. Ipinikit niya ang kanyang mga mata, huminga ng malalim, at hinayaan ang alaala na mukha ng kanyang ama na punan ang kanyang isipan. Dati siyang isang maliit na batang babae na may malalaking pangarap, nagsasanay ng mga hakbang sa tinikling sa maalikabok na patio ng dance studio ng kanyang ama. Ngayon, siya ay isang janitor sa isang corporate tower. Pinilit na sumayaw para sa isang tao na nakikita siya bilang isang libangan lamang. Ngunit marahil, naisip niya, maaari pa rin siyang makahanap ng isang hibla ng autonomiya dito. Maaari niyang piliin kung anong sayaw ang gagawin. Maaari niyang piliing ibuhos ang tunay na damdamin dito, kahit sino pa ang sumubok na agawin ito. Ang kanyang ama ay nagturo sa kanya na ang sayaw ay maaaring maghatid ng mga kwento na hindi kayang makuha ng mga salita. At kung gusto ni Kruger ng isang palabas, marahil ay bibigyan siya ni Aurora ng isa, sa kanyang sariling mga tuntunin. Sa eksaktong 3 oras ng hapon, ang kumperensya ng mamumuhunan ay nasa puspusan na. Ang mga hanay ng mga nakabihis na shareholder, mga prospective na kasosyo, at mga kinatawan ng media ay pumuno sa auditorium. Si E.R. Fischer ay nakaupo sa unang hilera kasama ang isang grupo ng mga executive mula sa European Robotics Division. Sa entablado, ang boses ni William Kruger ay umalingaw-ngaw sa madla. Pinupuri ang synergy ng bagong partnership. Ipinagmamalaki ang mga pinakabagong kagumpay. Nagiwisik ng mga biro upang mapanatiling magaan ang kapaligiran. Ang entablado ay nilagyan ng isang makintab na walkway. Malaking screen sa likod niya na nagpapakita ng logo ng Martin & Kruger na may kasamang mga promotional video. Si Aurora, na nakatago sa likod ng mga kurtina sa gilid, ay huminga na matatag upang pakalmahin ang panginginig sa kanyang mga paa. Ang track ng musika na kanyang pinili ay inihanda sa sound booth. Nagsuot siya ng simpleng itim na pantalon at isang fitted na pang-itaas, walang magarbong, ngunit isang bahagyang pag-alis mula sa kanyang uniforme ng janitor. Iginiit ng test crew na itapon niya ang mapurol na kasuotan para sa isang bagay na medyo mas makinis, kaya ito ang kompromiso. Malinis, minimalistic, sakat na komportable upang sayawan. Ibinigay ni Kruger ang kanyang mga huling pahayag tungkol sa pagpapalawak ng kumpanya. Pagkatapos ay iniunat ang kanyang mga braso na parang isang showman na malapit ng gumawa ng isang ilusyon. Mga ginang at ginoo, ang Martin & Kruger ay hindi lamang tungkol sa cutting-edge na teknolohiya. Tungkol tayo sa mga tao. Sabi niya, ang kanyang tono ay tumutulo sa pagsasanay na karisma. Naniniwala kami na ang bawat individual ay may mga hindi pa natutuklasang regalo, mga talento na maaaring magpasaya sa ating pamilyang korporasyon. Nais kong ipakilala ang isa sa mga individual na iyon ngayon. Siya ay bahagi ng aming koponan sa pasilidad, at mayroon siyang espesyal na sorpresa para sa inyo. Mangyaring tanggapin si Aurora Madrigal. Isang bahagyang palakpakan ang pumuno sa hangin. Kumabog ang puso ni Aurora. Inilit niyang gumalaw ang kanyang mga paa. Lumilitaw mula sa likod ng kurtina, saglit siyang naningkit sa liwanag ng mga spotlight. Lahat ng mata ay nasa kanya, daan-daang mga ito, posibleng higit pa kung ang kaganapan ay nailivestriam. Nilunok niya ng husto, pinaalalahanan ang kanyang sarili na ang isang pagtatanghal ay isang pagtatanghal. Sasayaw siya na parabang siya ay nasa entablado ng isang tunay na teatro, hindi isang corporate function hall. Lumayo si Kruger na may isang flourish na nagbibigay sa kanya ng spotlight. Pinatibay niya ang kanyang sarili para sa kahihiyan ng sapilitang pagtatanghal. Ngunit pagkatapos ay nagsimula ang musika. Malambos sa simula, isang tumitibok, malambing na biit na unti-unting naging isang bagay na mas dinamiko. Ipinikit ni Aurora ang kanyang mga mata, hinahayaan ang tunog na bumalo sa kanya. Nagsimula siya ng dahan-dahan. Ang mga braso ay dumadaloy sa isang banayad na arko sa itaas ng kanyang ulo. Ang bawat paggalaw ay sinasadya, nagmumula sa klasikal at kontemporaryong pagsasanay na pinagsikapan niyang pinuhin. Nararamdaman niya ang katahimikan na dumapo sa madla, isang halos nakikitang sorpresa na nagmumula sa kanila. Inaasahan nila ang isang novelty act, marahil isang mapaglarong gawain mula sa Sumayaw na janitor. Sa halip, binigyan sila ni Aurora ng kasiningan.
Aurora's nerves frayed with each passing day leading up to the grand investor conference. She spent every spare moment in that hidden multipurpose room in the basement, dancing to quell her anxiety. Even if this performance turned out to be another humiliating spectacle, she resolved to make it as true to herself as possible. Yet in the back of her mind lingered the recent conversation with Dr. Helmut Fischer, whose quiet promise of support offered a faint gleam of hope. Whether or not he could truly protect her from William Kruger's manipulations remained to be seen. On the morning of the conference, the entire Martin and Kruger International building buzzed with heightened activity. Security teams bustled in and out of the lobby, caterers with immaculate trays of hors d'oeuvres circled the halls. Important guests arrived in sleek black cars that lined the curb outside. A swirl of elegantly dressed executives milled about, checking schedules, adjusting ties, and ensuring everything would run smoothly for the day's presentations. Aurora found it impossible to focus on her usual cleaning duties. She tried not to draw attention to herself, but the staff lounge was rife with gossip, some of it delivered in hushed tones that suggested something major was about to unfold. "They say the board members from Europe arrived last night," one custodian mentioned. "Yeah, and I heard Kruger's planning some big theatrical announcement, bigger than anything he's done before," another commented, rolling his eyes. Each snippet of conversation set Aurora's heart pounding faster. She had received no direct instructions, yet no official request from Kruger to perform, but it was almost impossible to believe he wouldn't use her as part of his show. Just after noon, Aurora finished wiping down the conference room tables on one of the lower floors. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "They want you at the VIP lounge on the 52nd floor in 15 minutes, Denise." Aurora's stomach churned. Denise, her direct supervisor, must have been told to convey this. With a shaky breath, she packed up her supplies and headed upstairs. When the elevator doors parted on the 52nd floor, Aurora stepped onto a swath of plush carpet leading to a pair of towering double doors that opened into the VIP lounge. She could hear the hum of conversation, the clink of glassware, and see the swirl of expensive suits and dresses. Carefully, she slipped in through a side door, trying not to be noticed, but she barely had time to survey the room before a dark-suited assistant seized her elbow and guided her swiftly toward a corner. "You're Aurora, right? The one from facilities?" he asked in a clipped tone, eyes darting about for any sign of the CEO. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "Good, Mr. Kruger wants you in the staging area behind the banquet hall. Move quickly, he's expecting you." The assistant thrust a small envelope into her hand, then turned away without waiting for a response, merging back into the crowd of business elites. Aurora's fingers shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a simple directive typed in cold. "Be ready to perform a dance sequence at exactly 2:45 p.m. The music will be provided. You will stand at the left side of the stage until announced. Follow my lead. WK." She stared at the message, her heart hammering. No mention of an option to refuse, no sense of courtesy, just a command. As if her very humanity was secondary to Kruger's whims. She forced herself to breathe, remembering Dr. Fischer's soft reassurance. If this was the plan, at least she would try to dance with dignity, and hold out hope that Fischer might intervene if matters went too far. She slipped through a side corridor leading to the main banquet hall, which was abuzz with final preparations. Technicians adjusted stage lights and tested microphone levels. Several large screens displayed the Martin and Kruger International logo alongside the brand of the newly acquired European robotics firm. At the back of the stage, lavish floral arrangements framed the podium where Kruger would soon speak. Rows upon rows of seats fanned out, enough to accommodate hundreds of investors, stakeholders, and high-ranking employees. Aurora spotted Dr. Fischer near one of the screens, quietly chatting with a few Europeans in tailored suits. He caught sight of her, gave a slight nod, but didn't approach. She read tension in his features. She found a spot backstage and hovered there, the typed note still clenched in her hand. Soon, William Kruger appeared, flanked by his usual entourage of well-dressed executives. The group bustled backstage, double-checking schedules and exchanging last-minute details. Kruger's commanding presence dominated the area as he strode around, chest puffed out, making sure everything was perfect. Noticing Aurora, he approached with an unsettling glimmer in his eye. "Aurora," he greeted her, voice artificially warm. "We're about to begin, so you'll wait in the wings. When I signal, you'll step out onto the stage. We have a nice up-tempo piece for you to dance to. I expect you to give it your all, make it lively, exciting. These are our most important investors." Aurora swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Kruger patted her shoulder with patronizing confidence. "Good girl, and if you do well, we might discuss your future here." There was a loaded undertone in his words, a threat of sorts, a promise of potential rewards or punishments depending on her compliance. Aurora bit her lip to stifle her rising anger. The arrogance in his eyes reminded her of the humiliations she had endured these past weeks, the after-hours dance in his office, the forced demonstration in front of the managers. Memories of her father's voice steadied her. She inhaled, knowing that no matter how she was used as a spectacle, at least the dance itself was hers, a gift she'd honed since childhood. A few moments later, the lights throughout the banquet hall dimmed slightly. Soft, dramatic music played as a confident voice introduced William Kruger to the podium. The overhead lights revealed a sea of expensive suits and glittering evening gowns. Aurora peered from behind the curtain, seeing hundreds of powerful figures fixated on the stage. The hush of anticipation blanketed the hall. Kruger stepped forward, arms spread wide in a charismatic show of authority. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished investors, and our esteemed partners from Europe, I welcome you all to our annual investor conference, the first since finalizing the merger with Dr. Fisher's illustrious firm. Today, we stand on the precipice of groundbreaking innovation, synergy, and profitability. Polite applause filled the room. Dr. Fisher and a few of his European colleagues sat in the front row, their expressions reserved. Kruger continued, waxing poetic about synergy, integration, and the unstoppable growth he anticipated. His oratory skills had always been formidable, painting grand visions of the future and weaving in corporate jargon about leveraging cross-platform technologies and enhancing global market share. Aurora watched from the wings, shifting from foot to foot, dreading the moment she'd be summoned. She noticed Dr. Fisher tapping a pen restlessly on his knee as though anxious. Now, Kruger's voice rose, taking on a showman's tone. I'd like to provide you with a vivid example of the Martin and Kruger culture, a culture in which we celebrate the hidden talents and passions within our organization. Because innovation isn't just about new technologies, ladies and gentlemen, it's about unleashing the full potential of our people. Let me introduce you to someone who might surprise you. The overhead lights shifted, a narrow spotlight hitting Aurora's side of the stage. Her heart plummeted. She knew this was her cue. She braced herself, stepping out into the glare. Applause trickled awkwardly from the massive audience, uncertain about who she was or what to expect. This is Aurora Madrigal, Kruger announced, extending a hand. She joined us some months ago in a janitorial role, but as you'll see, she is so much more than that. Aurora, why don't you show our investors what you've got? The lights around Aurora brightened. She stood rigidly, blinking at the sea of faces. For a split second, panic nearly paralyzed her. Public speaking had never been her forte, and though dancing came naturally, the context of being displayed like an oddity made her feel nauseated. Yet the music started, a lively fusion of pop and electronic beats that reverberated through the sound system. She had no choice. She closed her eyes and let the music sink into her limbs. She drew a breath, stepped forward, and began to move. The routine that she'd practiced in the basement was more contemporary in style, with fluid transitions and occasional bursts of sharp rhythm. She didn't hold back, pouring her frustration, her dignity, her entire soul into each motion. The crowd's initial murmurs of confusion shifted to quiet captivation. Something about the authenticity of her movements, maybe the mix of vulnerability and resolute pride, held them transfixed. Her arms swept wide, her feet glided across the stage, and every step spoke the language of a person refusing to be cowed. She spun once, twice, letting the momentum carry her in a graceful arc, then paused in a poised stance at center stage, raising her gaze to the auditorium. For a moment, all she heard was her heartbeat pounding in time with the music, and the memory of her father's laughter when she was a child, how he'd clap joyously after she perfected a new step. The music ended on a vibrant chord. Aurora held her final pose, chest heaving, perspiration beading on her forehead. The stage lights glistened off the faint sheen of sweat on her arms. A hush gripped the audience for a fraction of a second, one suspended moment that felt like forever. Then thunderous applause erupted, echoing through the hall. People stood, some whistling or cheering. Even the jaded investors seemed genuinely impressed. Aurora blinked, stunned by the response. She turned her head slightly to see Dr. Fisher standing up in the front row, clapping emphatically. Some of the other Europeans followed suit, and soon the entire hall was awash in applause. This was the first time she danced freely in a long while, forced by circumstance, yet ultimately letting her passion shine through. Kruger strode back to the podium with a triumphant smile, soaking in the adulation as if it were directed at him. Magnificent, wasn't it? Another testament to how Martin and Kruger fosters talent at every level. He gestured for Aurora to stand next to him. She reluctantly approached, still catching her breath. He clapped a hand on her shoulder. A hidden gem in our midst. Now that's the spirit of innovation. It goes to show that in our corporate family, we want everyone to bring their best, whether in the boardroom or on the stage. Let's have another round of applause for Aurora Madrigal. The audience applauded once more, but now Aurora noticed something. Kruger's grin held a certain contrived air. Perhaps he was thrown off by the genuine passion Aurora had just displayed. Instead of a comedic sideshow, she had delivered a performance that commanded respect. For a moment, he seemed uncertain how to proceed, a glimmer of discomfort in his eyes. Yet he quickly regained composure. "Thank you, Aurora, you may step backstage now," he said, dismissing her with a flourish of his hand. Aurora offered a slight bow, though she burned inwardly at his casual arrogance. The applause died down, replaced by the rustling of programs and resumed conversation. She darted back to the curtain, heart still racing. As she slipped backstage, she exhaled in relief. The worst was over. The performance had garnered applause rather than ridicule. Perhaps she could slip away now, avoid further humiliation. But a crowd of executives and staff enthralled by her dancing approached to congratulate her, some offering handshakes or marveling at her skill. They showered her with praise, and though it felt good to be recognized, she remained on guard, aware that it was Kruger who wielded real power here. Eventually, the banquet program continued with Dr. Fisher's presentation about the robotics division. Aurora lingered near the backstage area, not sure if she was dismissed entirely or expected to remain. That's when Kruger himself appeared behind the curtain, scanning for her. As soon as their eyes met, he beckoned her over. "Aurora," he said quietly, a veneer of politeness barely covering an undercurrent of tension. "Great job up there. That dance was quite impressive, maybe a bit more than I anticipated, but that's fine." He leaned in. "I need you to do one more piece after Fisher wraps up, something with even more energy to close out the session on a high note. Keep them talking, you know." She stiffened. "Another dance, sir?" He shrugged. "Is that a problem?" A cold challenge gleamed in his gaze. She thought of her visa, of the job she so desperately needed, of the money she had to send home. "No, sir," she said at last, though every fiber of her being revolted at his brazen assumption she would simply comply. Kruger's lip curled in a self-satisfied smirk. "Fantastic, wait here, we'll call you back on stage when Dr. Fisher finishes." With that, he stepped away, disappearing among the stage crew. Aurora's chest felt tight. She didn't have more choreography prepared, she'd poured everything into that single performance. But apparently it wasn't enough for Kruger. She stepped over to a quiet corner backstage and stretched out her limbs, trying to calm her thoughts. Meanwhile, Dr. Fisher's voice carried from the podium, describing in detail the breakthroughs in robotics and AI their merged companies would soon unveil. At last, Dr. Fisher concluded to respectable applause. Aurora peered through a gap in the curtain, expecting Kruger to come back up. Instead, to her surprise, Dr. Fisher remained at the podium a moment longer. He cleared his throat, looking over the audience with thoughtful eyes. "Before I leave the stage," he said, "I'd like to offer a different perspective on what we witnessed earlier. Aurora's dance was no mere show, it was an expression of her heritage and her personal passion. In many corporate cultures, employees rarely get to reveal their full selves. We should applaud this not just for entertainment, but for the deeper message it carries. Each person here has a story, a background, a set of gifts that extend beyond the confines of their job description." Kruger, who had been heading to the stage steps, froze. The crowd listened quietly. Aurora caught her breath. Dr. Fisher glanced toward the side of the stage, and she realized he was looking at her even if he couldn't see her face. "This is what it truly means to be an inclusive organization," he continued. "It's not about forced displays or token acknowledgments. It's about genuine respect for every individual's potential. So, Aurora, if you're still backstage, I want to personally thank you for reminding us that being human is our greatest strength." Dr. Fisher stepped away from the podium to a burst of applause. Aurora's heart lifted in cautious hope. His words felt like an affirmation, a subtle stand against Kruger's manipulative showmanship. But as the applause died, Kruger took the stage again, wearing a tight-lipped grin that suggested he was not entirely pleased by Fisher's impromptu commentary. Kruger forced a jovial tone. "Well said, Dr. Fisher, well said indeed. Now let's wrap this conference on a high note, literally. Aurora, please come out once more. We can't let you slip away without giving us one more taste of those moves." The spotlight swung to the left side of the stage. Aurora inhaled, bracing herself. She stepped out, a polite smile on her face that belied her inner turmoil. The staff near the control panel started the second track Kruger had selected, a brassy pop piece with a driving beat. Aurora lifted her arms, trying to find the rhythm, but something felt off. This song was bombastic and gaudy, more akin to a dance club anthem. She attempted a few steps, letting muscle memory take over, though it clashed with her preference for elegant storytelling choreography. She noticed the audience's mild confusion. They'd expected something as graceful and heartfelt as her first performance. Halfway through the routine, her frustration peaked. She glanced toward Dr. Fisher, seated in the front row, and saw the empathy in his gaze. Another burst of movement came from her body, but it lacked the authenticity she'd shown before. Instead of exuding her usual fluid grace, she felt stiff, trapped in a forced spectacle. A few investors still clapped along, but the energy in the room had shifted. Then Kruger, who apparently wanted to amp up the excitement, strode right onto the stage. He gestured for Aurora to move aside as if he were about to join or direct her. "Come on, let's get a little more spark in this," he said into the microphone. Some audience members chuckled, thinking it a harmless bit of fun, but Aurora sensed the subtle threat in his stance. This wasn't about partnership or celebration. It was about controlling the stage, controlling her. He reached for her hand, trying to whirl her around as though in some half-baked attempt at salsa or swing. His touch made her skin crawl. She maintained a professional facade, completing a quick spin, but the forced intimacy made her face flush with discomfort. The audience tittered, uncertain whether to find the moment humorous or cringe-inducing. "That's it," Kruger crowed. "Show them how it's done." He stepped in front of her, arms raised above his head, encouraging the crowd to clap. But in his drunken performance of confidence, he stumbled over Aurora's foot. She tried to catch him before he toppled, but the microphone in his hand fell to the floor with a loud thud, sending feedback screeching across the sound system. Kruger nearly lost his balance, flailing awkwardly. A few people laughed outright, others gasped. The smug composure of the CEO cracked like an egg on stage. Fury flashed across Kruger's face. He picked up the microphone, turning on Aurora with a venomous glare. She froze, feeling a sudden dread coil in her stomach. He forced a laugh, speaking into the mic. "Well, it seems I've proven dancing is exactly my strong suit. Let's leave it to the professionals, or at least to those who have been practicing in secret while on the company's time." He aimed a pointed, mocking look at Aurora. A hush took the room. Dr. Fisher slowly rose from his seat, brow furrowed. Several board members looked at one another in confusion, trying to discern if Kruger was joking or leveling an accusation. Aurora's heart pounded. She could practically hear the implied threat that she'd been wasting company resources if she practiced dancing in the building. In that split second, she made a decision that would alter the course of the evening and her life at Martin and Kruger. She grabbed hold of the microphone, her fingers trembling, and fixed Kruger with steady eyes. A lifetime's worth of swallowed pride, humiliation, and frustration welled up inside her. "Sir," she said, voice quavering slightly, "I haven't used the company's time for my practice. I come in early or I stay late, and I never neglect my duties. Everything I do, my work, my dance, it's for my family, for my future. I respect this company and the people here, but dancing is my passion, my heritage, and I refuse to let it be trivialized as a party trick." A few audible gasps emanated from the crowd. Kruger looked both shocked and enraged that she had the gall to speak out. He tried to yank the microphone away, but Aurora held it tighter, swallowing the fear that threatened to paralyze her. "I appreciate that some of you enjoyed my dancing," she continued, her voice growing firmer, "but I never wanted to be forced into it as entertainment for those who see me as less than an equal. Dancing is my art, and I share it with dignity, not because my boss demands it." With that, she let the microphone slip from her grasp, the thud echoing in the stunned silence. Her entire body shook, but a liberated sense of relief coursed through her. She had spoken her truth, consequences be damned. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dr. Fisher stepped forward, climbing onto the stage. His expression was resolute. He picked up the microphone. "Aurora is right," he said, voice measured, "and I think it's time we acknowledge the line between celebrating an employee's talents and exploiting them." He shifted his attention to Kruger. "William, we never discussed forcing staff to perform. I certainly don't recall approving any spectacle that would humiliate a member of our team. Is this the culture we want to champion?" Kruger glared daggers at Dr. Fisher, struggling to maintain composure. The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. "I don't believe this is the place for such a discussion," he said icily, trying to corral the situation. "This is an investor conference, not a staff meeting. We can handle this internally later." But Dr. Fisher seemed unwilling to let the moment pass. Instead, he looked out at the shareholders and board members. "I disagree. The culture we create directly affects the company's reputation and performance. If we treat our employees with contempt or coercion, we undermine the very principles that drive innovation and trust." Several of the European board members nodded or whispered among themselves, apparently sharing Fisher's viewpoint. Some of Martin and Kruger's own board members also seemed unsettled, as though they recognized they could no longer turn a blind eye to Kruger's overreaches. Kruger tried to laugh it off, but the sound rang hollow. "Let's not blow a minor misunderstanding out of proportion." He shot Aurora a warning glance, then attempted to address the crowd more cheerfully. "It's all in good fun, folks. I'm sure Aurora understands that no offense was intended." Aurora remained silent, her head held high. She had no interest in smoothing over the CEO's narrative. The tension in the room escalated until an older board member with silver hair and a crisp navy suit stood from his seat. He tapped his cane on the floor for attention. "Mr. Kruger, in light of this display, perhaps we should evaluate how we're presenting our corporate culture. We've received glowing reports of Aurora's diligence, and her dancing ability is indeed remarkable, but if she feels coerced, we have a serious morale and ethics issue on our hands. The last thing this company needs is a scandal or rumors about employee mistreatment." Kruger's face went pale, though he struggled to mask it with a polite nod. "Of course, we'll address any grievances immediately. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Langdon." He forced a smile at the audience, which now buzzed with uneasy chatter. "Let us conclude this segment. We've had enough excitement for one afternoon." He offered a tight gesture of dismissal, and the overhead lights shifted, signaling a break. As the audience dispersed for refreshments, Kruger turned to Aurora. His expression was a thunderstorm of barely contained anger. "You," he hissed, "stay right here until we can discuss this privately." Dr. Fisher stepped closer, placing a hand on Aurora's shoulder. I think we should all discuss this in a more appropriate setting, William, along with HR and a few other board members, he said calmly. For a split second, Aurora feared Kruger might lash out physically, so intense was the fury in his eyes. Instead, he merely pivoted on his heel and stormed off the stage, beckoning a cluster of executives to follow. Dr. Fisher gave Aurora a reassuring nod and guided her backstage, away from the murmuring spectators. They ended up in a smaller adjacent conference room, accompanied by 2 senior board members and a representative from HR who had hurried to the scene after seeing the commotion. Kruger paced by the window, trying to collect himself. Aurora sat quietly on a leather chair, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Dr. Fisher broke the silence. We need to address what just happened. Aurora, you've made it clear you felt coerced into dancing for corporate events. Is that correct? She swallowed, nodding. Yes, it started that night in Mr. Kruger's office with a group of executives. I was told to dance in front of them as a novelty. I didn't feel I could refuse without risking my job. Then came the auditorium demonstration and now this investor conference. Each time I had no real choice. One of the board members, a stern-looking woman named Evelyn Pierce, frowned. Mr. Kruger, is this accurate? Did you make Aurora perform against her will? Kruger spun around, frustration radiating from him. I never forced her per se. I only gave her opportunities to showcase her talents. I wanted to celebrate her. She was never threatened or penalized for declining. Aurora's eyes stung with tears of anger. That's not entirely true, she said, voice soft but steady. Every time you made it clear that my job security depended on my compliance, and you teased me in front of everyone. You call that celebrating? It was humiliating. Kruger's hands balled into fists at his sides. He was clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a low-level employee. His gaze swept the room, noting how the others observed him warily. Realizing that anger alone wouldn't help him, he tried a different angle. His tone softened, as if attempting contrition. Listen, Aurora, if I came across as overbearing, I apologize. I truly am sorry you felt humiliated. My intent was never to degrade you. He forced a smile, but his eyes were flat. Perhaps I got carried away with the idea of showing your talent to others. If you want, I can grant you some compensation, a bonus for your trouble. An awkward silence followed. Aurora saw how the board members stiffened. They realized Kruger was trying to buy his way out of accountability. She mustered courage and spoke again, though her voice trembled. I don't want hush money, Mr. Kruger. I only want respect, and to ensure no other employee is subjected to this kind of treatment. That's what matters. To Aurora's surprise, Evelyn Pierce nodded in agreement. Dr. Fisher remained composed, but Aurora caught the faintest of smiles at the corner of his mouth, as if proud of her stance. The HR representative finally cleared his throat, glancing from Kruger to Aurora. I think the best course of action here is to conduct a formal review. We'll speak to all parties involved, gather testimony, and ensure fair treatment. We certainly don't want any employee feeling coerced. Kruger, sensing the seriousness of the situation, forced a more compliant expression. Of course, a formal review, let's do what's necessary, he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed how he truly felt. But might I suggest we keep this matter internal? Our company reputation is paramount, especially with the merger so fresh. Dr. Fisher stepped in. Reputation is critical, William, but so is integrity. If we prioritize external appearances at the expense of employees' well-being, we risk rotting from within. His tone was measured, leaving little room for argument. Evelyn Pierce looked from Kruger to Fisher and finally to Aurora. We'll handle this swiftly but thoroughly. For now, Ms. Madrigal, you're free to go. You'll be contacted for an official statement soon. If you feel any retaliation or if your employment is threatened in any way, please report it directly to HR or to me. Understood. Aurora nodded, tears threatening to spill as relief mixed with anxiety. Thank you, she said. Kruger's gaze remained cold as she rose to leave, and an uneasy sense of finality weighed in the air. Dr. Fisher walked her out into the corridor, where they paused near a large window overlooking the city. I'm proud of you for speaking up, he murmured. It took courage. Aurora managed a shaky smile. I just hope I didn't seal my own termination or start a storm I can't weather. Fisher exhaled. Look, Kruger has his pride, but the board is becoming more aware of his behavior. I suspect this could mark the start of changes within the company, though it won't happen overnight. In the meantime, I'll do everything in my power to ensure you're protected. That's a promise. With that reassurance, Aurora slipped away. She grabbed her belongings from her locker and fled the building before the investor conference concluded, not wanting to linger for any further spectacle. Days turned into a week. A hush settled over her interactions at Martin and Kruger. She kept to her routine, diligently cleaning offices, avoiding Kruger's floor whenever possible. Oddly, rumors about the incident at the conference circulated in hushed, perplexed tones. Some employees speculated that Aurora had shamed Kruger publicly. Others heard whispers that top board members were launching an internal probe into workplace conduct. Aurora was called into an HR office to provide an official account of her experiences. She recounted each instance of coercion and belittlement, nomming the witnesses present. The HR representative took notes, maintained professional neutrality, and promised her that steps were being taken. A few days later, Dr. Fisher found her again in the basement multi-purpose room, where she was quietly practicing a fluid contemporary piece. His dress shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, and the lines of fatigue on his face suggested many tense meetings and negotiations behind the scenes. "I have some news," he said, stepping into the space. "The board has reviewed your case. There was enough evidence, emails, eyewitness accounts, and so forth to demonstrate that Mr. Kruger crossed the line of professional conduct. The outcome is complicated. He'll stay on as CEO for now because he's got significant power, shares, and alliances. But the board has mandated corrective measures, including an official apology to you and sensitivity training for the entire executive leadership. HR has also been given broader oversight to prevent future abuses of authority." Aurora paused, her stretching, her heart fluttering. An official apology from Mr. Kruger himself. Fisher nodded. He might not be thrilled, but yes, that's what they've decided. Furthermore, you'll be given the option to transfer out of janitorial duties if you wish, possibly into a role aligned with your interests. The board thinks it might be wise to give you more opportunities in the company, considering your skill set and the positive publicity from that first dance video, which, ironically, has spread beyond the company intranet. Some local performing arts groups are praising you online. Aurora's lips parted in surprise. I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever expected. Are you sure?" Fisher gave a gentle shrug. "It's the board's decision, with a push from me and a few others who believe in your potential. At the very least, it's an opportunity to step away from the situation that's caused you so much distress. Or you can remain in facilities if that's your preference. No pressure, truly. We just wanted you to have options." Her mind spun with possibilities. A new position, perhaps in the events department, or even something that allowed her time to audition for dance shows in the city. She'd never have dared dream it possible. Yet a lingering doubt kept her from feeling too elated. Kruger's influence hadn't evaporated. He was still CEO, still powerful. This apology might be nothing more than a superficial act for show. She needed to see if genuine change could happen or if it was all a smokescreen. A few days later, a modest gathering took place in a quiet conference room on the executive floor. Aurora, Dr. Fisher, Evelyn Pierce from the board, the HR representative, and William Kruger himself. The CEO stood near a polished wooden table, arms crossed, jaw set. The tension in his eyes suggested he despised every second of this ordeal, yet the board mandate compelled him to comply. Aurora braced herself, not sure what to expect. Evelyn Pierce cleared her throat. "Mr. Kruger, you have a statement to deliver." Kruger looked at Aurora, chin raised, as though addressing a subordinate who'd caused him endless headaches. He spoke in a clipped tone, but his words were carefully measured. "Aurora, I acknowledge that my methods in encouraging you to dance for corporate events placed undue pressure on you, and I failed to respect proper professional boundaries. For that, I apologize. It was never my intent to make you feel demeaned or coerced." Aurora's pulse fluttered with anxiety. She could see how the words nearly caught in his throat. He clearly hated this. And while the apology sounded formal rather than heartfelt, it was still a remarkable moment. A billionaire CEO forced to back down to a janitor. The power of truth and company oversight had prevailed, at least to some extent. "Thank you," Aurora said softly, choosing her words with care. "I accept your apology. I hope we can all move forward in a way that respects every person in this company." Evelyn Pierce gave a satisfied nod, scribbling a final note on her clipboard. "Very well, I believe this concludes the matter. Aurora, HR will finalize details for your potential transfer. Mr. Kruger, we appreciate your compliance. Let's all aim to restore a sense of harmony here." Kruger offered a tight smile, then turned on his heel and left the room. The tension he radiated lingered in the space even after he vanished. Evelyn and the HR representative soon followed, leaving only Aurora and Dr. Fisher behind. The weight of the confrontation seemed to lift, replaced by a cautious hope. Dr. Fisher patted her shoulder gently before walking her out. In the weeks that followed, Aurora noticed subtle shifts around the office. A new company-wide memo emphasized respect and non-discrimination, along with clear guidelines for reporting harassment or coercion. Rumor had it that Kruger was under close watch by the board. One more major infraction and they might force him out, no matter how many shares he owned. Some employees expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to him. Others remained too fearful to be openly critical, but at least a spark had been lit. The once intimidating aura around Kruger had been punctured. Meanwhile, Aurora's own life took a surprising turn. True to the board's word, she was offered a choice of positions. One was a junior administrative role in the events department, which would involve helping organize company functions and external conferences. Another was a position in the corporate social responsibility (CSR) team, coordinating volunteer and cultural programs that reached out to local communities. Both opportunities were far beyond her initial station as a night shift janitor. After careful deliberation, she chose the CSR role, partly because it resonated with her desire to help others and share her cultural heritage in a more genuine, empowering way. She also reconnected with her passion for dance outside the corporate environment. The short viral video that circulated had piqued the interest of a small local dance company, which invited her to audition. She went to their studio in Queens one weekend, nervous but determined. The audition panel watched her with growing admiration. 2 days later, she received an email offering her a part-time slot in their upcoming production, an experimental contemporary piece that would rehearse in the evenings. She could keep her new corporate role while pursuing the dream she thought she had lost forever. On a crisp morning, just as she was about to start her first official day in CSR, Aurora found herself walking down the same corridor where this all began. The marble floors gleamed under the bright overhead lights. She paused outside the office that once intimidated her, the corner suite belonging to William Kruger. The door was shut, blinds drawn, giving the impression of a fortress under siege. She remembered how terrified she used to be merely passing by it. A wave of memories rolled through her, cleaning the floors at night, hearing the roar of executives laughing, being singled out to dance as a joke, the humiliating feeling of being seen as a novelty, and finally standing on stage to declare that she wasn't merely an object to be trotted out. An emotional swirl threatened to overwhelm her, but she steadied herself. She had survived it. She had, in her own way, won. She was about to move on when the office door opened. Out stepped Kruger himself, sifting through some paperwork. He glanced up, meeting her gaze. For a brief moment, they simply looked at each other. In that moment, she saw cracks in his usual facade, the subdued posture, the faint circles under his eyes. This man, who had once wielded unassailable authority, now carried a hint of uncertainty. Perhaps some portion of him recognized he'd gone too far, or maybe he was simply unnerved by the board's restrictions. Whatever the case, Aurora sensed he wouldn't easily forget the lesson gleaned from their conflict. He gave a curt nod, some semblance of acknowledgement, then continued down the hallway without a word. She did the same, turning the opposite direction, feeling no need to speak. There was nothing left to say. Their unspoken exchange carried enough weight. She was no longer just a janitor at his mercy, and he would never see her as powerless again. During lunchtime, Aurora made her way to her new workstation, a modest cubicle among the CSR team. The desk had a small welcome note, a company laptop, and a binder of orientation materials. She sat down, heart fluttering with excitement and trepidation. It wasn't a dance studio, but it was a stepping stone to a better life, a place where she could use her skill set, her empathy, cultural passion, and organizational abilities to foster genuine community outreach. While sifting through the orientation binder, she smiled at a particular page describing the company's philanthropic initiatives. Perhaps she could propose a project that celebrated cultural arts, highlighting employees from diverse backgrounds. If done right, it wouldn't be exploitative but empowering. She envisioned inviting voluntary performances from staff who truly wanted to share their cultures, no forced amusements, no power plays. A legitimate platform for self-expression. Her phone chimed. It was a text from her younger sister in Manila. "Received the tuition money. Thank you so much. 8. Graduation next year. Wish you could be here." Aurora typed back quickly, tears springing to her eyes. "I'm proud of you. I'll see you soon, I promise." After she sent the message, she gazed around her new workplace, reflecting on how far she'd come in just a few tumultuous months. She had arrived in America with hopes of simply making ends meet, only to be thrust into a surreal battle with a billionaire CEO. And yet, through a combination of courage, support from unexpected allies like Dr. Fisher, and her own unwavering passion for dance, she had found a stronger footing in the company and in her own sense of self. That evening, Aurora stepped out of the Martin and Kruger building, the day's setting sun dipping below the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Her thoughts drifted to the upcoming dance rehearsals at the small company in Queens. She felt tired but invigorated. She was forging a path that allowed her to honor both her responsibilities and her dreams. On the sidewalk outside, she paused to watch a street performer spinning and popping to a hip-hop track. Passersby dropped coins in a hat. The performer's movements were hypnotic, echoing the freedom Aurora found whenever she danced. She gave him a few dollars and a smile, remembering how the simple power of movement had carried her through so many trials. As she continued down the bustling street, she knew challenges would always lie ahead, especially if Kruger decided to retaliate somehow. But for now, real change had begun. She was no longer an anonymous janitor living in the shadows of corporate might. She had a voice, a talent recognized on her own terms, and a future that no one could simply buy or belittle. With every step she took, Aurora felt her father's spirit dancing alongside her. She could practically hear his gentle encouragement. When you dance, dance wholeheartedly, even if your audience is only the wind. That simple truth had sustained her through exploitation and fear. It had allowed her to reclaim her dignity in the face of a tyrant's ridicule, and it would guide her forward toward whatever stage, literal or metaphorical, awaited. That night at the small studio in Queens, she stood amid a handful of dancers warming up at the bar. The director called for everyone to gather in the center. Aurora joined them, feeling an electrifying sense of belonging. Here, no one knew or cared about her battles with a ruthless CEO. They only saw a fellow dancer. The director turned on the music, an ethereal melody that began softly, building to a crescendo. Aurora inhaled, letting the gentle notes wash over her. She remembered the nights of mopping floors, the humiliating request to dance in Kruger's office, the forced spectacle at the investor conference. But she also remembered the moment she stood her ground on that stage, refusing to let her heritage or passion be reduced to a cheap thrill. With graceful determination, she eased into the choreography, aware that each movement was now truly hers. No scornful boss, no corporate charade, no sense of shame, only the art, the release, the beauty that dance had always been for her. Step by step, turn by turn, she felt a renewed hope blossoming within. In that moment, free from all constraints, Aurora realized she had indeed found her happy ending, not because life was perfect or free of struggles, but because she had reclaimed her power to define herself. And for a woman who once feared she might remain invisible, a mere cleaner in the shadows of a multinational empire, that was victory enough. The music built to its crescendo. She leapt, extended her arms in a soaring arc, and landed lightly. The hush in the studio was breathtaking. A tear slipped from her eye, not of sadness but of exhilaration. For the first time since setting foot in the United States, she truly felt she had come home, to herself, to her dreams, to a future shaped by her own hands. And somewhere in that final note, if only in spirit, she could sense William Kruger's power slipping away like smoke in the wind, replaced by the unstoppable beat of her own heart. In that resonance, Aurora's journey had found its conclusion, a testament to courage, culture, and the enduring strength of a dreamer's soul.